So Joab, tell us a little bit about your background. What was international development work like in Nairobi and India?
Right, thank you. So, Bailey, I'm a U.S. Fulbright scholar uh, here in the United States, and I'm a lecturer, university lecturer and consultant in matters to do with development. Currently a GTA at K-State in the College of Education and also in the Department of Sociology. Academically and professionally, I'm a holder of a Bachelor of Arts degree in Development Administration Studies and 2 master's degrees, one in Development Administration and the other degree in Sociology with a focus on international development. I'm a Kenyan national, and I consider myself as a development thinker and trainer.
Thank you.
As regards my development experience in India and in Nairobi and in India, as you've asked, this is what happened. So after the completion of my high school in Kenya, I proceeded for higher studies in India, right? And then that's where I did most of my studies, my first degree and second degree in India, right? What was interesting about international development in India is the fact that that is the first time I was ever introduced to development issues, right? And by the way, India is well known in matters of community development, issues to do with community development and rural development. Thank God the university in which I went, or I studied also, was focused much on rural and community development as well, right? And I remember the many days we'd go into the villages and spend days there, really, trying to work with people and just have the practical experience of community development. And so the Indian experience was much more of training, learning that practical experience, as I began this development work, right? Now, in Nairobi, that's different. So besides working in development within Nairobi, which is a capital city, I've also been involved in development work in the whole of Eastern Central Africa. So it's not just in Nairobi, but in Uganda, Tanzania, Rwanda, Burundi, South Sudan. I've been involved in development programs in those countries as well, right? And very interesting. So this is what I find interesting about development work, especially when you talk about development work in the developing world, right? So one, development work, international development work in the developing countries is largely donor driven, right? And of course, basically what happens is it's driven by the West or by the developed world, right? The other thing that I find interesting about international development work in the developing world is that it is focused basically on basic necessities of life. So I'm talking about things to do with people having access to food, right, which is so basic. We're talking about health aspects. We're talking about issues to do with education, infrastructure, right? And then I'm giving these examples because I can compare with what is happening in the West, in the developed world, right? So it's kind of like a different focus as far as international development work is concerned in the developing world, right? What I find also interesting is, and I think this is important also to mention, is that international development in the developing world needs to be reviewed in my analysis, right? Why? Because if you want to sustain most of these development programs in the developing world, I think donors from the West will need to do some kind of a change in terms of how they do their stuff to be able to sustain some of these development programs. That's really my thinking.
So when you think of the phrase global city, what do you think? In what ways are cities like Nairobi, Lagos, and Johannesburg misunderstood?
Okay, so I think it's important to provide a context. I need to provide some background. Mm-hmm. Why do you talk about global cities anyway? So the 21st century has been described as a global century. So we are in what's described as a global century. Today, the world is considered as a global society. All right, and so globalization has had this immense effect on what is happening all over the world, right? And so And that's where the global city concept is actually derived from, right? When I think about a global city, this is what comes into my mind. The picture, of course, and I'm sure this would apply to any other person, right? So what comes to my mind is I see those huge, big cities like, London. So that's what comes in my mind. So you see London, the skyscrapers, right? London, New York, right? Tokyo in Japan, right? Dubai in the Middle East, right? And so you think about those skyscrapers up there, and very good infrastructure, and all this diversity, for example, in terms of people and all that. That's the picture that comes to my mind. But let me describe what a global city is. A global city, in my thinking, is we're talking about urban places, basically, that are strategically placed, and they're strategically placed for a reason, right? And the reason is to be able to have some kind of an influence on what is happening globally. So they are strategically placed and indeed connected to what is happening globally. That's really what I think would be more of a global city. So, and they have certain features, certain characteristics. One is they are international, they are multicultural, they are cosmopolitan, among other things. So talk about this high population, in most of those, cities, very good infrastructure, and so. One other thing which is important to mention about a global city is they are also considered as hubs that facilitate global economy, if that makes sense. Yeah, right. That's what comes in my mind. Right.
Okay, so we've been looking at theories of national development, modernization, dependency, and world systems. Can you explain a little bit about Walter Rodney's main argument and how it explains, or how it helps to explain global inequality?
Right. Interesting. So, we live in a world that is really unequal, if that makes sense. For somebody traveling, for example, some of us who have had an opportunity to travel the world. So you move from Asia, Africa to Europe and the American continent, and you see a huge difference, a disparity in terms of how people live, right? So we live in a world that is really very uneven, right? Very unequal, if that makes sense, right? And Walter Rodney has this very interesting perspective to global inequality. Just like you've mentioned from those three theories that you mentioned, so modernization, you mentioned, which other theory did you mention there?
Dependency,
right? And the world systems theory as well, right?
Yes.
My quick thinking from Walter Rodney's perspective is that he also captures those three perspectives, those three characteristics that you've just mentioned, right? In his work and perspective, he looks at globalization as global inequality as a product of what has so far been mentioned. Now, let me explain this in a much more simpler way. According to Walter Rodney, he says global inequality is actually a result of what is happening in the West or in the developed world. In fact, he points global inequality as a problem that has been caused by the developed world. Now, one thing that you need to bear in mind about Walter Rodney is that he was more of a not just a historian, but also he had this Marxist, ideology, and so he kind of looked at the West as where the problem was. He says capitalistic tendencies tend not to be very good for countries that are not capitalist in nature and countries that are, for example, in the developing world. Right? And so he points out and says global inequality is actually a product of capitalism and, of course, the developed world. Right? And, of course, he argues and says that, if you want to understand global inequality, we need to look at history. Right? Remember, I said he was a historian. And so he looked at history and says, Africa, and by the way, he focuses much more on Africa, more than these other continents. And so he said, Africa is where it is today because of the history. All right. So what's the history of Africa? One is Africa was colonized. So he looks at colonization as a major factor that contributed to where Africa is and why Africa is not doing pretty well compared to other countries. But the other thing he looks at is exploitation. So he says the developed world has to a large extent exploited the developing world, and especially Africa. And that's why Africa continues to, be where it is in terms of, in terms of development, right? And so his perspective basically was for this global inequality to come to an end, or to lessen, the word I'm using is lessen, then what we need to do is the African continent needs to disengage itself from the capitalist world, and then Africa will be able now to perhaps do well in terms of development. So his perspective was one, perhaps Marxist in a way, but he looks at history. He also looked at, that interaction and relationship between Africa and the rest of the world, especially the developed world, Europe to be specific. And he says the problem is through this interaction. When Africa interacts with Europe, in whatever way, then that has been, really the problem. And that's really what causes global inequality, right? And that's why he says the best thing to do is for Africa to disengage, from having this kind of interaction, with the developed world. That was his thinking. I know you had asked this question much earlier about the misconception. Mm-hmm. I'm using the word misconceptions about African cities, right? Mm-hmm. The reason behind the misconception is what we all know. So if you'd allow me, then I'll specifically point out the fact that, the developed vis-a-vis the developing countries. Mm-hmm. And this whole thinking that, really there's nothing much to expect from the developing world. And so even in terms of the global cities, we can't really expect perhaps Africa or the developing world to have what one would consider as global cities. But I want to say this, that is perhaps changing in a way. Now, I'll give you a few reasons why that is important. One, if I take the example of Africa as a continent, mm-hmm. we have cities like Lagos, Johannesburg, you did mention them, Nairobi, right? Mm-hmm. Cape Town in South Africa, right? Luanda in Angola, and all these cities. What is happening is, to begin with, Africa as a continent is so huge and vast, but also in terms of population, right? So we have this middle class that is growing in Africa, mm-hmm. and you expect this group of people really to be the ones that are likely to, be in charge of what is happening in these cities in Africa. So one of the advantages we have in Africa is the increasing middle class, right? And the influence that they can have, the effect they can have on any given, economy. But also, generally speaking, the population in Africa is growing so fast. In fact, compared to any other continent in the world, Africa's population seems to be growing at a very fast rate, right? And I want to look at population growth as something good, right? Because you're talking about people, you're talking about market as well, right? And when we talk about a global city, one of the things that we see in a global city is this diverse population, but also high population growth, really. That's why we talk about mega cities, by the way, So a mega city is described as a mega city because of its population. So the higher the population growth, that's part of how we describe really a global city, right, or a mega city for that matter. So there are good reasons as to why there's hope as far as Africa is concerned. There's a misconception, really, because of what we all know. When we discuss some of these development theories like modernization and all those, they look at Africa as really not really doing pretty well in terms of development, which is also true to some extent. I must admit that, we still have challenges that African cities would face, from crowded cities to again, poor infrastructure, in some of those cities, and some of those challenges to do with the development, basically, So those are still there, but I'm saying there's so much potential, and things are now changing, all right? And given that we have these advantages that I'm mentioning about the middle class that is rising, high population growth, and the fact that, really there's so much that is happening in Africa right now that really would make these global cities to have these global cities in Africa as well, right? Diversity, which is a very important aspect of global cities, by the way. During our class, which I shared with Becky, right? With Dr. The one who left was our head of department, Laszlo. You were in that class too, right? So I wrote a paper about Nairobi as a city, by the way, and my argument was Nairobi needs to be looked at as a global city as well. And I gave reasons why Nairobi would be considered as a global city. And one of the reasons I gave was, one, innovativeness, right? So much innovation going on, right, in Nairobi as a city. I also talked about creativity, right? I also talked about the fact that Nairobi is considered as, it's well connected, in the whole of African continent. I mean, if you want to fly to any part of Africa, Nairobi really is a very convenient place for you to fly to any part of the world, right? And so I gave quite a number of reasons why Nairobi could, to some extent, be considered as a potential global city, right? It may not have reached that status of New York and London and all that, but there's so much potential, really.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.